We just bought the single best BMW ever made. All right, okay, so the BMW M1 was pretty spectacular. So maybe the second best BMW ever made. Actually, the E30 M3 was probably even a little better than this car. Maybe the third best, BMW 2002, fourth best. We bought the fifth best BMW ever made. But it's not what you think. This car looks like something it is not. You're gonna wanna stay tuned to find out exactly what's going on here. This is, of course, the legendary BMW M5. The first generation called the E28. This car is an absolute icon and I can't believe we own it. Except, it's not an M5. I mean, obviously, yes, it looks like one, it's got M badges on it, but this car is hiding a pretty big secret because, let's be honest, we can't afford a first-gen BMW M5. They built under 2,000 and they're like 40, 50 grand for a good one. Let's see what's going on here. The first generation BMW M5 had a very significant engine. It was a straight six. Here in the US, we got a model called the S38, and abroad it was called the M88. In the US, of course, we had to have catalytic converters because it was America in the 1980s. But regardless of that, here in the US, these pumped out a remarkable 256 horsepower, which doesn't sound like a lot by modern standards, but when this car came out in the mid to late 1980s, it was the fastest sedan in the world. This blew people's minds. Now, the engine was developed from the M1 supercar. 4 valves per cylinder, really high-tech stuff. Except that this doesn't have that engine. This has an engine called the M30, which was a pretty standard straight six used in standard BMW passenger cars, like the 5 Series, the 6 Series, and even the 7 Series. Now, instead of having over 250 horsepower, this one, well, it's got 182. So you're probably thinking at this point, well, it's pretty clear what has happened. Someone took a standard 5 Series, slapped on a special body kit, added some M badges, and called it a day. But no, this car is little known, especially by Americans, but still pretty significant, because even though it's not a true fire-breathing M5, this was an early example of BMW adding an M badge to a non-thoroughbred M car. The M badges on this model are there on purpose. This is a 1987 BMW M535i, and you're probably thinking, all right, what's the big deal? I see M-badged cars all the time nowadays that aren't a true M model. And you're right, if you go on the BMW website, there's stuff like the M240i, the M340i, M440i, M550, and then there's even the SUVs like the X3 M40i. But back in the 1980s, adding the M badge to a non-true M car was extremely rare. And this car was never actually sold here in the US, which is kind of interesting. Now, adding the crazy M performance to standard passenger vehicles really took off for BMW in the 1980s. You had like the legendary E30 M3, you had the M6, the M5, that kind of thing. Now, prior to that, there were a couple of different examples of M badging on non-M cars. So think like the E12 BMW, the first Gen 5 Series had a model of the M535. But this was a very unusual thing back in the 1980s, and that M badge does belong on the back. This is exactly how it left the factory. And just like M badge cars of today, even though this may not be a true full-fledged M car, it still gives you some pretty cool accessories, both from a visual and performance standpoint. From a styling standpoint, in the rear, we've got this really cool lip spoiler, which is very similar to what you'd find on an M5, and then this lower body kit with these slits, very 1980s, and I think it looks fantastic. Now, from a mechanical standpoint, in the back, these had limited slip rear differentials, and then depending on the market in which it was sold, they also had M Technic suspension. Technic was kind of like the old M Sport division in the 1980s, so they had sport suspension in them as well. Now, although the engine is the same as what you'd find in like a 535 or a 735, the transmission was something interesting. So you could get this with a standard 5-speed manual, but you could also get the M535 with a short ratio dogleg transmission, so second and third were in line, great for racetracks. And then this car actually came out of Japan, so this originally would have had an automatic transmission, and then the previous owner swapped in a 5-speed. Now, the interesting thing about the automatic transmission is that this was one of the few M-branded cars from the 1980s where if you didn't know how to drive a stick, you could still drive an M535. They built 9,483 BMW M535i 28s, of course, mid to late 1980s. Compare that to genuine M5s, somewhere around 2,000 of those. These are much more common. And actually, interestingly enough, they sent some of these to South Africa, somewhere around 800 in what they call knockdown kits, where they were then assembled in South Africa. But roughly 10,000 M535is, but never sold in the US. Well, why is that? So the first thing you'll notice is the body kit, the overall design on this car wouldn't have worked with the American style bumpers. Now the US bumpers were terrible. They extended like 9 feet out in front of the car to comply with crash safety ratings here in the US, and they didn't feel it worth spending the extra money to develop a US version of this same kind of basic front end. The other reason though is when this car was new, the M brand really didn't have all that much recognition, panache, or prestige in the US yet. So it didn't really gain a lot of speed until like the late 80s and into the 90s when you had like the E36 M3s, the E34 M5 into like the E39s. And then of course the M brand really had a lot of value. But when this car was new, it was still relatively a new thing, especially for US consumers. So that is the main reason this car was never sold. However, here in the US, we did get a model called the 535IS, which is very similar to this, so same engine. However, different bumper design to meet the US standards. So we did get a sportier version that wasn't a true M5 in the 535IS, but that didn't have the little M badge there on the hood. So one very interesting feature on the foreign market M5s that never existed here in the US was actually the headlight design. Now, of course, the US 5 Series did have the kind of 2 basic headlights, outside for low beams, inside for high beams, but here in the US we had identical sized actual lenses themselves because they were sealed beam units per US regulation. Now, because this is a Japanese car, these had the Euro style headlights where the actual outside bulb and outside lens is larger than the inside one for the high beams, and it gives it kind of a cool, sinister look. And then when you pop the hood, there's a simple place to replace the bulbs. So this M535 also has the sport seats, which are phenomenal even by modern day standards. And then in the back of the seats, you did have the little M logo here as well, the 3 colored stripes, which is really, really cool. But the seats themselves are some of the best I've actually ever experienced. You do cool stuff, like for example, you do have the little thigh support. There's a knob you twist that extends out the bottom portion of the thigh support. Here, of course, being a Japanese car, no electric seats. These were manual seats. And then my favorite feature that these old BMW seats did is there's actually a lever here, and you push down, and then the whole seat will actually pivot forward and backwards, and you can really get kind of this cool driving position where your thighs are perfectly supported. But very excellent seats in these old Beamers. I loved them. Now you're probably thinking, well, if this car came from Japan, why am I sitting on the left side of the car? It was actually a symbol of prestige in Japan. If you bought a Euro car like a BMW or Mercedes, it was a status thing to actually purchase one in left-hand drive and then drive it on the left side of the road. But that's how it was way back in the day. Everything is super chunky and very square, and also oriented toward the driver. So everything you see is some motive of square. Not a lot of roundness going on whatsoever, but very 80s and very retro. So the interior airflow meters in the 535 is pretty bizarre. So rather than having like feet or defrost, they gave you these 3 little sliders, and then these are actually used to control exactly where the air flows. And they give you like little cheat sheets on how to best direct the air. So for maximum defrost, you want the temperature all the way to hot. You can see that on the left knob. Then you want the fan all the way to the right. And then it looks like you want the up slider all the way to the right to direct air up. But these do take a little bit of getting used to, but the cool thing is they're infinitely adjustable, so you can blow air exactly where you want it. Now these are the window switches. They're located down here by the gear shift, and there are these perfect squares, one for up and one for down. One kind of funky thing is you can actually operate them when the key is completely out of the ignition, which is nice. Oftentimes you forget to roll up a window, and you can do that over here using these square little buttons. The onboard information panel in this car is super, super cool. Now this lets you know when any of these things have failed, and here is the basic idea. So when you go to start it up, the brake light one always illuminates, then you hit the brake and it goes away. The engine oil one is actually a broken sensor on the engine, but that does tell you, for example, like when you're low on engine oil. And then just to make sure that all the warning bulbs work, you push a button here and they all illuminate, so you know that all the bulbs are good. And then if something has gone wrong, it'll also flash a check on the dashboard. I'll show you there. And that lets you know to look up and make sure that everything is working. Now, another funky thing on these old Beamers is the integrated computer. So it's located over here to the right of the steering wheel, and it shows you all sorts of stuff, such as the time, the date, your average speed. You can set like a limit for speed as well. You can see the consumption, in this case, liters per 100K, range, 452 kilometers. There's a little timer as well. You can see outside temperature. There's a setting for code, so you can actually like enter a code so that people don't steal your car, and then you have to remember to plug it in and then set and reset down here. But these are a very cool thing. They actually are surprisingly reliable, and most of these 80s BMWs, these are functional. The back seat in the BMW 5 Series is remarkably roomy. This is my driving position at 6'1", and I have plenty of space, good headroom as well. Now the rear seat isn't as bolstered as the front one, so you certainly go sliding around, but there are a couple of cool things, like you still get the M stripes even in the back seat, and then I do like the adjustable headrest, which you can kind of fold down for when there's no one in the back seat, so you can see out the back. This car has something called the M Technic steering wheel, which is a phenomenal BMW design. Once again, we see the little tricolors down here, but perfect size. You get little kind of ribbed elements on the rear of the steering wheel, which feel good on your hand. And then there's no horn button. Instead, on each spoke, you have these little pads. Push in on them. Turn the car on, hang on. And that's how you engage the horn. One very cool feature on the 5 Series is actually the light switch, which is just a simple toggle from 0 to mid to on. Now the cool thing I like about this is when the key is on, the actual position is always illuminated. So if it's at night and you need to see what position you're turning the lights into, you can see 0, parking lights, and on. They illuminate on this little panel. Now, one of my favorite aspects of these old BMWs are the no-nonsense gauges, and when you turn on the lights, they glow red. They're actually lit from the front like you'd find on an airplane, and they look fantastic. Now, I do understand that the M535 is rather a confusing trim. However, the reason we bought this instead of an M5 is this was an $18,000 car, and an M5 in this condition with about 100,000 miles would be like a $30,000, $40,000 car, maybe even more. So these are really pretty good value. Now they are definitely not quite as fast, but they still handle beautifully. You still get the fun manual transmission, and they're phenomenal looking, probably the best looking 5 Series ever made. Now, I don't know what the long-term plan is, but hopefully we might be able to track down an M5 engine to swap into here. I think it'd be cool to build like a true M car out of the M535. And this really is one of the early beginnings of the M branded cars that aren't the standard M cars. Even though people still sometimes look at them as posers, they are great vehicles and fantastic to own. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. As always, this has been Tommy behind the camera, Matt. Check out TFL-studios.com for the latest and greatest in classic reviews.